psychotic strategists who took a broken democracy and engineered it into a global war machine. This wasn't a team of loyal brothers. This was a nest of vipers. To understand how Nazi Germany managed to conquer Europe, engineer the Holocaust, and sustain a multi-front war against the world's greatest superpowers, we must look at the men who held the strings. Hermann Göring, the flamboyant warlord. Heinrich Himmler, the cold-blooded architect of terror. Joseph Goebbels, the psychological manipulator. And Albert Speer, the technocrat who fueled the war. Hitler intentionally structured his inner circle to fight amongst themselves. He believed in a twisted version of social Darwinism that, by forcing his top ministers to constantly compete for his favor, only the most ruthless would survive and execute his will. There were no clear lines of authority. Ministries overlapped, commands contradicted each other, and betrayal was the currency of the Reich Chancellery. Every morning, these men woke up wondering not just how to defeat the Allies, but how to politically stab each other in the back. But when their agendas aligned, the results were devastatingly efficient. In this tactical breakdown, we pull back the curtain on the psychotic inner cabinet of the Third Reich, the strategists who built the empire, and whose massive egos eventually tore it down. Before a single tank could roll into Poland, Hitler needed to capture the minds of 80 million citizens. For that, he relied on a man with a severe physical limp, an immense inferiority complex, and an absolute genius for psychological warfare, Dr. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Goebbels understood a fundamental rule of human psychology long before modern media existed. He famously stated that if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. He didn't just censor the press. He took absolute control of it. He subsidized the production of cheap radios, the Volksempfänger, ensuring that Hitler's voice penetrated every single living room, kitchen, and factory across Germany. Goebbels pioneered the art of the political spectacle, the massive Nuremberg rallies, designed with towering pillars of light reaching into the night sky, were his creations. He turned politics into a secular religion, casting Hitler as a flawless savior and framing Germany's minorities as existential biological threats. But Goebbels' true strategic test came in 1943, after the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad. When morale was plummeting, he delivered his infamous total war speech at the Berlin Sportpalast. He asked the crowd, "Do you want total war? Do you want it more total and radical than anything we can even imagine today?" The crowd screamed in approval. Goebbels had successfully re-energized a dying population, turning a military disaster into a fanatical crusade that extended the war by 2 bloody years. While Goebbels managed the mind, the skies belonged to a former World War I fighter ace who became the second most powerful man in Germany, Hermann Göring. Dressed in custom-designed, flamboyant uniforms covered in medals, and living a life of extreme luxury fueled by stolen art, Göring was the public face of Nazi military might. Hitler gave Göring unprecedented power. He was the chief of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, the head of the 4-year economic plan, and Hitler's officially designated successor. In the early days of World War II, Göring looked like a strategic mastermind. His Luftwaffe was the devastating tip of the Blitzkrieg spear, obliterating air forces in Poland, France, and the Low Countries. But Göring's massive ego would prove to be his strategic undoing. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, his arrogance blinded him. He promised Hitler he could crush the Royal Air Force in days. When British bombers launched a small, retaliatory raid on Berlin, a humiliated Göring, who had boasted that if a single bomb fell on Berlin, "You can call me Meyer," shifted target from British airfields to civilian cities. This single tactical error gave the RAF time to recover, handing Germany its first major strategic defeat. As the war dragged on, Göring retreated into a fog of morphine addiction and luxury at his massive estate, Hall. He continuously lied to Hitler about aircraft production numbers, assuring the Führer that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped Sixth Army at Stalingrad from the air. It was a physical impossibility. Göring's vanity left the German army starving in the snow, proving that his loyalty was never to tactical reality, but to his own survival in Hitler's good graces. If Hermann Göring was the loud, ostentatious face of the regime, Heinrich Himmler was its silent, terrifying ghost. A failed chicken farmer with an obsession for occultism and racial purity, Himmler looked more like a low-level schoolteacher than a mass murderer. Yet, he built a state within a state that executed the most horrific crimes in human history. The SS. Himmler was a master bureaucrat. He systematically took control of every police force in Germany, combining them with the SS and the Gestapo, while Hitler spoke in broad, ideological concepts about eliminating his enemies. Himmler was the technocrat who figured out the logistics. He transformed hatred into an industrial process. Under his direct command, the SS constructed and operated the vast network of concentration and extermination camps across occupied Europe. Himmler viewed this mass slaughter not as a crime, but as a historic, difficult duty. In a secret 1943 speech to SS officers in Posen, he called the extermination of the Jewish people a glorious page in our history that has never been written and shall never be written. Himmler's strategy was total control through absolute terror. His SS empire controlled factories, plundered resources, and held the entire population of occupied Europe under a continuous death warrant. By 1944, Himmler's power was so vast that his shadow loomed larger than Hitler's own generals, making him the true, terrifying engine driving the Third Reich's ideological war. By 1942, Nazi Germany was facing economic collapse. The Blitzkrieg had failed in Russia, and the country was now locked in an industrial war against the combined manufacturing power of the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States. To survive, Hitler turned to his young, brilliant personal architect, Albert Speer. Speer was appointed Minister of Armaments and War Production. Unlike the fanatical old guard of the Nazi Party, Speer was an educated, highly rational technocrat. He looked at the war purely as a data and logistics problem. He streamlined factories, eliminated bureaucratic red tape, and gave industrial managers direct authority over production lines. The results were terrifyingly effective. Under Speer's management, despite relentless Allied strategic bombing campaigns that leveled German cities day and night, German weapons production didn't go down, it tripled. He produced more tanks, planes, and ammunition in 1944 than at any other point in the war. But Speer's economic miracle was built on a foundation of unadulterated human cruelty. To fuel his factories, he partnered directly with Heinrich Himmler to use millions of slave laborers from the concentration camps. Prisoners were worked to death in subterranean weapons factories, starved, and executed when their productivity dropped. Speer presented himself as an apolitical artist just doing his job, but he was the vital, life support system that kept Hitler's genocide operating long after the war was strategically lost. April 1945, the final act, as Soviet artillery shells pounded the Reich Chancellery into dust. The internal structure of Hitler's brain trust fractured into complete chaos. Safe inside the subterranean concrete walls of the Führer bunker, the grand illusion was finally breaking down. One by one, the Vipers turned on their master and each other. Hermann Göring, safe in southern Germany, sent a telegram to the bunker asking if he should take over leadership of the Reich. Hitler, fueled by a final burst of paranoia and encouraged by Goebbels, flew into a rage, stripping Göring of all his titles and ordering his arrest for high treason. Days later, news reached the bunker that Heinrich Himmler, the man Hitler called Der True Heinrich, loyal Heinrich, had secretly attempted to negotiate a surrender with the Western Allies behind the Führer's back. It was the ultimate psychological betrayal. Hitler ordered Himmler's execution, but the SS chief had already disappeared into the shadows, disguised as a common soldier. Only Joseph Goebbels remained completely loyal to the very end. On April 30th, after Hitler committed suicide, Goebbels briefly became chancellor of a ruined nation. One day later, refusing to live in a world without National Socialism, Goebbels and his wife poisoned their 6 children before committing suicide in the Chancellery garden. Albert Speer chose a different path of survival, disobeying Hitler's final Nero decree, which ordered the total destruction of Germany's remaining infrastructure before surrendering to the Allies. The reckoning came at Nuremberg. Goring was sentenced to hang, but cheated the gallows by swallowing a hidden cyanide capsule hours before his execution. Himmler committed suicide shortly after being captured by British troops. Albert Speer served 20 years in prison, projecting a calculated myth of the good Nazi who knew nothing of the regime's worst crimes, a lie history would later thoroughly debunk. Hitler's brain trust proved that evil does not require a single monster. It requires a network of ordinary men, intellectuals, bureaucrats, and administrators who willingly suspend their morality to serve a fanatical vision. Their legacy is not one of strategic genius, but an eternal warning of how easily civilized minds can organize the destruction of the world. Thanks for watching History Insignia TV. If you found this tactical, breakdown insightful, hit the like button, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments below on which strategist was the most dangerous. See you in the next episode.
May 1945. The sirens across Europe finally fall silent. The Third Reich, a regime built on iron and blood, has collapsed into ash and ruin. Across London, Paris, and New York, millions flood the streets to toast to an hard-won era of peace. The long nightmare of the Second World War is over. But inside a locked, smoke-filled military headquarters in occupied Bavaria, the atmosphere is anything but celebratory. It is low. General George S. Patton Jr., the brilliant and erratic commander of the legendary United States Third Army, stands alone over a massive tactical map of Europe. His ivory-handled revolvers rest on his hips, and his fingers trace a red line directly past the broken borders of Germany, cutting straight through Poland and stopping dead on Moscow. While the world celebrates a new dawn, Patton is quietly calculating how many days it will take his battle-hardened tanks to reach the Kremlin. To him, the war hadn't ended. It had just been paused, and he wanted to unpause it. Turning to his inner staff, Patton muttered a phrase that would terrify Washington if it leaked. We're going to have to fight them sooner or later. Why not now, while our army is intact and our columns are hot? History books tell us the Cold War began years later, fought with shadow spies, proxy conflicts, and nuclear standoffs. But they completely omit a terrifying hidden window in May and June of 1945, where the world almost burned in a third world. War not because of a political crisis, but because a rogue American general was actively trying to start one. This is the untold story of Patton's secret rearmament of German troops, his illegal border provocations, and the frantic, undocumented scramble by Dwight D. Eisenhower to stop his own most dangerous general before he set the globe on fire. To understand the massive information gap hidden beneath the official history of the day, we have to look at the map of Europe exactly the way Patton saw it. The Red Army hadn't just captured Berlin. They had swallowed Eastern Europe whole. Millions of Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of brutal total warfare against the Wehrmacht, stood organized and occupying everything from Prague to Vienna. Washington and the mainstream press viewed this as a monumental diplomatic triumph of the Allied coalition. General Patton, however, looked at the horizon with absolute horror. He saw a massive, totalitarian machine sitting right on the doorstep of a completely exhausted, bankrupt, and defenseless Western Europe. Patton's personal diaries, which were heavily censored for decades after his death, reveal an unsettling truth. He genuinely believed the Allied High Command was throwing away the very victory they had just spent years bleeding for. He wrote bitterly, "We have destroyed what could have been a barrier against communism and replaced it with a monstrous tyrant. Most generals obey foreign policy, but Patton believed he answered to a higher power and a self-proclaimed mystical destiny. He was entirely convinced he had lived past lives as a Greek hoplite, a Roman legionary, and a cavalryman under Napoleon. To him, the plains of Central Europe were just another historic canvas where he was destined to conquer an empire. By mid-May, Patton decided he wasn't going to wait for a green light from political bureaucrats in Washington. He began taking secret, highly unauthorized practical steps to prepare his Third Army for a sudden offensive eastward. This is where the standard historical narrative completely breaks down into a hidden conspiracy. As part of the official surrender agreements, Patton's forces had rounded up hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war. Supreme Allied protocol dictated these men were to be immediately disarmed, logged, stripped of their military structures, and placed into labor camps. But Patton gave his corps commanders an astonishing verbal directive that defied every treaty signed by the United States. He ordered them to maintain the internal command structures of select German panzer and veteran infantry divisions entirely intact. German officers kept their uniforms, their men, and their organization. Even more shocking, German military mechanics were quietly ordered to keep servicing their Panther and Tiger tanks, their half-tracks, and their heavy artillery pieces instead of dismantling them. To any outside inspector, it appeared the Third Army was simply suffering from a massive logistical bottleneck in processing the sheer volume of surrendering troops. In reality, Patton was preserving a highly disciplined, fanatically anti-communist ghost army. He openly told his inner circle, "We can weaponize them, integrate them into our own armored columns, and push the Red Army back across the Volga in a matter of weeks." It was a gamble that completely violated the Yalta agreements. If Soviet intelligence got wind of it, the alliance would instantly rupture, triggering a hot war on the spot. And Patton wasn't content with just waiting for the spark. He went out to find it. By late May, he took his most dangerous step yet by ordering unauthorized high-altitude tactical reconnaissance flights. American scout planes crossed directly over the demarcation lines, photographing Soviet supply hubs, bridge deployments, and troop concentrations deep within the Soviet zone. On the ground, Patton's four war carry units began conducting incredibly aggressive border patrols, intentionally pushing into unmapped gray zones. On several occasions, American and Soviet armored cars stood bumper to bumper on isolated dirt roads, weapons drawn, waiting for someone's finger to slip. Patton wasn't trying to avoid an incident. He was actively hunting for a border clash to use as a justification to launch his tanks. He told his command group, "If they start a fight, I will finish it right in their own backyard." By early June, the reports of Patton's rogue logistical maneuvers and hostile border patrols finally leaked north to the Supreme Allied headquarters in Frankfurt. General Dwight D. Eisenhower read the intelligence intercepts with absolute dread. I could spend years managing the volatile egos of the global alliance on a knife's edge. He knew that if Patton moved just one single tank division past the line, the fragile post-war peace would shatter instantly. Eisenhower immediately bypassed standard channels, picked up the secure line, and ordered Patton to report to his headquarters under total secrecy. What followed was an explosive, closed-door confrontation between the two old friends. Eisenhower screamed at Patton, demanding to know why he was keeping organized German divisions on the payroll. Patton fired back, accusing the politicians of cowardice, famously shouting that they would eventually have to fight the Soviets anyway, so they might as well do it while the US held the industrial upper hand. Eisenhower had to make a choice to save global. He had to break his most successful combat general. Within weeks, Patton was quietly but systematically stripped of his beloved Third Army command and reassigned to a meaningless desk job overseeing a military history group. The man who had conquered Europe was effectively neutralized. Just months later, in December 1945, General Patton was riding in his staff car on his way to a pheasant hunt in Germany when a military truck suddenly collided with his vehicle at a low-speed intersection. It was a minor crash that left everyone else unhurt. But Patton was thrown forward, breaking his neck. 12 days later, the unstoppable general died in a hospital bed, paralyzed from the neck down. To this day, historians debate whether that crash was a tragic coincidence, a final, dark mechanism used by a desperate world to ensure the mad general could never start the war he so deeply craved. The monument to Patton stands today in Luxembourg, but the true lesson of May 1945 remains hidden in the shadows. That sometimes the most terrifying threat to peace isn't the enemy you face, but the unstoppable warrior fighting right beside you. Please comment your opinion in the below comment box.
America's Ghost Army of World War II. The artists who fooled the German Panzerwaffe. It is the summer of 1944. The fields of Normandy are choked with the thick, metallic stench of cordite, burning diesel, and damp earth. To the German High Command, scanning the horizons through high-powered optics, the situation appears terrifyingly clear. Just beyond the tree line, a massive American armored division is assembling. The unmistakable clank of heavy steel tracks echoes through the valley. The deep, guttural roar of hundreds of Sherman tank engines vibrates through the soil. Radio frequencies are alive with urgent military chatter, coordinates being mapped, fuel logistics being calculated, orders being barked by seasoned commanders. The German officers do not hesitate. They reroute their battle-hardened panzer divisions, shifting thousands of troops and heavy artillery to meet this massive, imminent threat. They dig in, bracing for an iron onslaught. But if a German scout had managed to slip through the lines and walk directly up to one of those formidable Sherman tanks, they would have discovered a reality that defied sanity. If they reached out a hand to touch the cold, riveted armor plate, their fingers would not strike steel. They would push into pressurized rubber. If they leaned against the multi-ton war machine, it would bounce. If 4 American soldiers walked over, they would not climb inside to start the engine. Instead, they would simply pick the entire tank up by its sides, carry it across a muddy field, and set it down somewhere else. The roaring engines, they were coming from massive, state-of-the-art speakers mounted on the backs of disguised trucks, playing custom-engineered soundtracks miles away. The frantic radio chatter, a carefully orchestrated script, performed by actors sitting in tents with telegraph keys, intentionally allowing the enemy to intercept their broadcasts. This was not the United States Army's elite vanguard. This was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. To history, they are known simply as the Ghost Army. They were an army of painters, illustrators, sound designers, architects, and actors. Their weapons were not bullets, shells, or bayonets. Their weapons were canvas, speakers, rubber, and pure unadulterated bluff. Armed with nothing but inflation valves and a staggering amount of audacity, these 1,200 men were dropped directly into the meat grinder of Europe to stand between the lethal German Panzerwaffe and the fragile Allied lines. They were ordered to stage a massive, multi-sensory lie, and if the enemy ever realized it was an illusion, the Ghost Army would be annihilated in a matter of minutes. To understand how the Pentagon arrived at the desperate, brilliant decision to send a collection of art school graduates to fight Adolf Hitler's elite panzers, one must understand the bleak mathematics of the Western Front in 1944. The Allied landings at Normandy had succeeded, but the breakthrough was agonizingly slow. The German army, though retreating, was far from defeated. They were professional, heavily armed, and led by commanders who understood the terrain perfectly. Every mile the Allies gained was paid for in blood. The Supreme Command faced a constant, terrifying problem: vulnerability. Whenever an Allied division moved to attack, it left a gap in the line somewhere else. If the Germans spotted that gap, they would drive their armored fist straight through it, cutting the Allied supply lines and turning the campaign into a catastrophe. The Allies did not have enough real tanks to cover every mile of the front. They needed an army that could be everywhere at once. They needed a phantom force that could materialize out of thin air, draw the enemy's attention away from the real bloodbath, and vanish back into the shadows. The concept of military deception was not entirely new, but it had never been attempted on this scale, nor with this level of scientific precision. The British had used dummy tanks made of wood and canvas in the North African desert to mislead Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel. But the European theater was different. The terrain was dense. The weather was unpredictable, and German intelligence was hyper-vigilant. Wood and canvas would no longer suffice. The deception had to be absolute. It had to appeal to the eyes, the ears, and the intelligence networks of the Third Reich simultaneously. The call went out across America, targeting a very specific demographic. Recruiters swept through the nation's elite art institutions, the Pratt Institute, the Cooper Union, the American School of Design. They looked for men who spent their days thinking about perspective, color theory, acoustics, and stagecraft. Young men like Ellsworth Kelly, who would later become a giant of American abstract art. Bill Blass, who would become a titan of global fashion. Arthur Singer, an extraordinary wildlife illustrator. These young men thought they were being drafted to camouflage factories or design recruitment posters. Instead, they were brought to Camp Forest in Tennessee, sworn to absolute secrecy under the threat of treason, and introduced to a specialized arsenal of illusion that felt more like a Hollywood studio than an army installation. The strategy of the Ghost Army relied entirely on a concept they called the 4 pillars of deception. For the illusion to succeed, it had to withstand every method of observation the German army possessed. If even one pillar cracked, the entire illusion collapsed, exposing thousands of real Allied troops to flanking maneuvers, and leaving the artists themselves completely defenseless. The first pillar was visual deception. This was the domain of the inflatable army. The engineers of the 23rd had developed a revolutionary line of pneumatic dummies. Using heavy-duty rubberized fabric, they created life-sized replicas of Sherman tanks, jeeps, trucks, and artillery pieces. These were not crude shapes. They were meticulously designed. From a distance of several hundred yards, or from the cockpit of a German reconnaissance aircraft, they were completely indistinguishable from the real thing. They had canvas covers, painted serial numbers, and realistic shadows cast by their hulls. But deploying an inflatable tank was an art form in itself. The artists quickly realized that a pristine, perfectly clean tank sitting in a field looked suspicious. Real tanks were filthy. They tore up the landscape. So, the men of the Ghost Army would spend hours using shovels and specialized tools to dig artificial tank tracks into the mud, leading up to the rubber decoys. If a dummy tank was placed under a camouflage net, it had to be done poorly on purpose. The artists understood the psychology of the German observers. If a position was too perfectly hidden, it looked fake. If it was slightly exposed, as if by a careless soldier, the German intelligence officers would believe they had made a brilliant discovery. The second pillar was sonic deception, perhaps the most technologically advanced and terrifyingly effective tool in their arsenal. The military recognized that in the dense forests and foggy valleys of Europe, soldiers often heard an army before they saw it. To exploit this, the army partnered with Bell Laboratories to create a massive, high-fidelity sound library. Engineers recorded the authentic sounds of every imaginable military activity. They spent weeks at armored bases, recording the clatter of tank tracks turning on gravel, the screech of brakes, the profane shouting of mechanics, the building of pontoon bridges, and the idling engines of entire infantry regiments. These sounds were pressed onto massive, experimental 16-inch theater records. To play them in the combat zone, the Ghost Army was equipped with state-of-the-art wire recorders and colossal, 250-pound speakers designed by the military. These speakers were mounted on the backs of armored half-tracks. The acoustic projection was immense. Under the right atmospheric conditions, these sound trucks could project the convincing illusion of an entire armored division moving through the night, up to 15 miles away. The men operating these sound trucks faced an extraordinary psychological burden. They would drive through the pitch-black European nights, completely alone on deserted roads, blasting the sound of a massive tank advance through the fog. They knew that if the Germans believed the sound, an immediate barrage of heavy artillery would rain down directly on their unarmored half-tracks. They were literally daring the enemy to kill them with sound. The third pillar was radio deception, known officially as spoof radio. The German military possessed highly sophisticated signals intelligence units that monitored allied radio frequencies around the clock. They could identify the unique rhythm and style of individual radio operators, a characteristic known as an operator's fist. The radio operators of the Ghost Army were masters of mimicry. They would study the exact radio procedures, call signs, and operators' habits of real divisions that were currently stationed miles away. When that real division moved out to conduct a secret attack, the Ghost Army's radio team would step into the vacuum. They would stay behind and generate a massive web of fake radio traffic. They would talk about mundane logistics, complain about the weather, request fuel deliveries, and transmit encrypted orders that they knew the Germans would intercept and crack. To the German codebreakers in Berlin, it appeared undeniable that the veteran division was still sitting safely in its original position, when in reality, that division was already 20 miles away, preparing a devastating surprise assault. The fourth and final pillar was atmosphere, what the actors of the 23rd called the scenic effects. This was the connective tissue that bound the entire lie together. The artists realized that an army is not just machines and radio waves. It is made of human beings. If German spies or sympathetic civilians in occupied towns looked closely, they would notice the details. Therefore, the men of the Ghost Army would put on fake uniform patches, identifying themselves as members of elite divisions like the 2nd Armored or the 75th Infantry. They would drive their trucks in continuous loops through French and Belgian villages, changing the bumper markings on each pass to make it look like thousands of troops were moving through. Their officers would walk into local cafes and taverns, deliberately dropping hints about upcoming operations, knowing that the bartenders or patrons might be informants for the German intelligence network. They created an entire ecosystem of gossip, movement, and visual clutter that made the Phantom Army feel alive. The true test of this bizarre experiment came in September of 1944. During the brutal fighting along the Moselle River, the American Third Army, commanded by the aggressive General George S. Patton, was pushing hard against the fortified city of Metz. Patton's armor was moving fast, but his lines were stretched dangerously thin. A massive, 20-mile gap opened up in the American line near the town of Thionville. German intelligence picked up on the vulnerability. The lethal German Panzerwaffe began massing its remaining armor, preparing to launch a catastrophic counter-offensive through that undefended gap to cut Patton's army in half. If they broke through, the American advance would grind to a halt, and thousands of men would be trapped. The only force available to fill that 20-mile void was the 1,200 artists and technicians of the Ghost Army. They received their orders in the middle of the night, rushed to Thionville, hold the line, and convince the German army that a massive American armored juggernaut was waiting for them. The men arrived in the dark, working in frantic, disciplined silence, while the visual team unrolled their rubber tanks and inflated them with air compressors under the cover of the trees. The sonic team positioned their massive speaker trucks along the riverbanks. The radio operators filled the airwaves with a symphony of fake military traffic, announcing the arrival of the fictitious vanguard of the American armor. As the sun rose over the Moselle River, the illusion was set. To the German scouts looking across the water, the American line looked impenetrable. They saw the distinct profiles of Sherman tanks peeking out from the brush. They saw tracks gouged deep into the mud. They heard the terrifying, low-frequency rumble of armored engines warming up across the river. The German commanders hesitated. Their aerial reconnaissance confirmed the presence of a massive force. According to their calculations, attacking this position would be suicidal. Instead of driving through the open gap, the German panzers halted their advance, dug into defensive positions, and began firing their heavy artillery across the river at the rubber tanks. The artists huddled in their shallow foxholes, listening to the terrifying shriek of incoming German 88mm shells. They watched as their meticulously painted rubber tanks were blasted into shreds of smoking fabric. But every shell that hit a rubber decoy was a shell that did not hit a living American soldier. For several days, the 1,200 men of the Ghost Army successfully held a 20-mile gap against a veteran armored force, using nothing but air, sound, and unyielding courage. By the time the German command realized they had been fighting a phantom, the real American reinforcements had arrived, sealing the gap and securing the flank. But the Ghost Army's masterpiece, their most dangerous and consequential operation, was yet to come. It took place in March of 1945 during the final, desperate push into the heart of Germany, Operation Plunder. The objective was the Rhine River, the historic, sacred barrier of the German homeland. The British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was preparing a massive, million-man assault to cross the river at the city of Weasel. Was to be a highly coordinated, devastating set-piece battle. The problem was that the Germans knew Montgomery was coming. They had heavily fortified the opposite bank, positioning their fiercest remaining infantry, artillery, and anti-tank units directly in his path. If Montgomery launched his crossing against those prepared defenses, The casualties would be catastrophic. The Allies needed a miracle to draw those German guns away from Weasel. The Ghost Army was called upon to deliver that miracle. Their mission, codenamed Operation Viersen, was their largest and most complex deception of the war. They were ordered to convince the German High Command that the main American crossing of the Rhine would not take place at Weasel, but 10 miles to the south, near the city of Viersen. This was a monumental task. They had to simulate not just a few tanks, but 2 entire divisions, the 30th Infantry and the 79th Infantry, totaling over 30,000 men. The 1,200 artists of the Ghost Army moved into the area, transforming the landscape into a massive, bustling staging area. They inflated hundreds of dummy tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. They set up fake supply depots, using canvas and wood to mimic mountains of ammunition crates. They lit fake campfires at night, and left real garbage scattered around to make the positions look inhabited. The Sonic team pulled off an engineering marvel. They mixed multiple tracks of recorded sound, creating a continuous, terrifyingly realistic audio landscape of thousands of men building pontoon bridges, launching assault boats, and moving heavy machinery down to the water's edge. For nights on end, they blasted this auditory nightmare into the fog of the Rhine. The deception worked with devastating perfection. The German High Command swallowed the bait completely, believing that the main Allied hammer was about to fall on Viersen. They ordered their artillery, batteries, and their remaining elite troops to shift 10 miles south, away from Montgomery's actual objective. They aimed their guns at the Phantom Army, waiting for an attack that would never come. On the night of March 23, 1945, Montgomery's real forces launched their assault at Weasel because the German defenses had been stripped and moved south to fight the Ghosts. The British troops crossed the Rhine with astonishingly light resistance. The crossing was a spectacular success, cracking open the final natural defense of the Nazi regime and paving the way for the total collapse of the Western Front. The 1,200 artists of the Ghost Army had successfully blindsided the entire German High Command, saving thousands of lives in the process. When the war in Europe finally came to an end in May of 1945, the men of the 23rd Headquarters, Special Troops, did not receive a victory parade. They were not allowed to tell their wives, their parents, or their children what they had done. The Pentagon took every blueprint, every sound recording, every after-action report, and stamped it with the highest level of military classification. The Cold War was beginning, and the American military recognized that the techniques perfected by the Ghost Army, the psychological manipulation, the acoustic engineering, the electronic warfare were weapons that might need to be used again. The artists were ordered to return to civilian life and bury their memories deep in the shadows. For over 50 years, the official history of the Ghost Army simply did not exist. The men who had used creativity to defeat tyranny went on to shape the cultural fabric of post-war America. Bill Blass revolutionized the fashion industry, bringing a distinct, modern American style to the runways of the world. Ellsworth Kelly redefined abstract art, his massive, bold blocks of color hanging in the world's most prestigious museums, ironically, a style born from his wartime experiments with shape and space observation. Arthur Singer's illustrations of birds educated generations of nature lovers. Yet, for decades, whenever these men were asked about their time in the war, they could only give vague, generic answers. They told people they had been stationed in Europe, or that they worked in camouflage. They could not explain that they had stood in the freezing mud of the Ardennes, holding off German panzers with rubber balloons. They could not tell anyone that they had saved the lives of their fellow soldiers using stagecraft. It was not until 1996 that the United States government finally declassified the files of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The world finally learned the truth about the 1,200 men who had staged 24 separate combat operations directly on the front lines, risking their lives without any traditional weapons to protect them. The legacy of the Ghost Army is a profound testament to a different kind of courage. In a conflict defined by industrial slaughter, massive artillery barrages, and the brute force of iron and steel, these men proved that intellect, creativity, and sheer audacity could alter the course of history. They did not conquer territory through destruction. They conquered it through imagination. They stared down the terrifying power of the German Panzerwaffe, looked into the abyss of the 20th century's darkest hour, and won their battles by pulling off the greatest magic trick the world has ever seen. Please write your opinion in the comment box. Thank you.
October 22nd, 1946. 3 o'clock in the morning. Deep inside the Soviet-occupied zone of a shattered post-war Germany, the freezing autumn silence is suddenly broken by the heavy thud of military boots. Thousands of Soviet Red Army soldiers, backed by the notorious NKVD secret police, fan out across the ruined streets of Berlin, Dresden, and Leipzig. They are carrying pre-printed lists, loaded submachine guns, and an order signed directly by Joseph Stalin. They approach the homes of Germany's most brilliant minds, the rocket scientists, nuclear physicists, jet propulsion engineers, and chemical experts who had spent